Hi, welcome to Journey to Justice. I'm Eiko Kosasa, and today I interviewed Maivan Clech Lam, a well-respected legal scholar and a professor emeritus of the City University of New York Graduate Center. Lam has long been active with indigenous groups fighting for their people's rights, both here in the islands and at the United Nations. This is a two-part interview. In part one, Lam reflects upon her life growing up in Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War, the early years of the sovereignty movement, and discusses the ideas of legal imperialism and settler colonialism. Part two focuses on the function and scope of the United Nations document, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Lam explains its usefulness as a tool when asserting a people's rights or protecting their lands. Today's program is part one. I began the interview by asking Lam to share where she was born and raised.
I was born in Vietnam. My mother was Vietnamese and my father was French. Due to the Second World War ending at about the time I was born, things were very unsettled in Indochina, and it ended up that my mother took her two daughters to Thailand as a refugee among other Vietnamese refugees from the war zone to Thailand, which was a safe haven. Mm-hmm. So basically I spent the first 15 years of my life in Thailand, raised by my mother alongside with my sister, and we were raised very much with a double tradition of Confucianism on the one hand and Catholicism on the other hand, you know, a double whammy if ever there was one. On the other hand, I appreciate some of the things that came from those two traditions. I think that both basically emphasize a sense of duty that you owe, you know, to the collective in the case of Confucianism. And I think basically the better side of Catholicism, the liberation Catholics, very much emphasize the duty owed to humanity and the entire creation, you know. So I didn't hear the discourse of rights and of individualism until much, much later in my life. And looking back, I think that may have something to do with what choices I thereafter made. So after that, I eventually came to the United States to go to college. And as I said, one of the sources of influence in my life was Catholicism. And as a result, we were very anti-communist, right? My mother very much so, and so was I, until I went to grad school at Yale in the field of Southeast Asian Studies. I happened to go to a film that was shown on campus in New Haven. I think it must have been the year 1965 or 66. And it was a film made by a communist Australian filmmaker named Wilfred Burchett. And it was entitled Air War over Vietnam. And it was the film that I know changed my political orientation there and then.
Wow.
Right. It was such a powerful film. It just basically had him film the raw data of all the people in Hanoi running for their dear lives, diving into manholes, grabbing babies, sticking them down first because the American planes were shrieking through the skies, dropping bombs on the city. Wow. Okay, and because I understand Vietnamese naturally, I could hear the sounds that he captured, you know, the Vietnamese screams, quick, Charlie, come here, things that the American audience could not fathom. And that made such an impact on me that I got out of there with a simple conclusion that nothing ever justifies this kind of destruction.
Wow.
Okay, and I think that that's been my path ever since. I am hugely suspicious and antagonistic, more than suspicious, antagonistic to unequal power, excessive power, because excessive power permits excessive destruction. You know, so right after that, I began to plunge myself into the anti-American war in Vietnam movement that was beginning to happen in the U.S. At first, a number of us Asian students, in fact, we started with a group of Vietnamese students, and we banded ourselves together and we called ourselves Vietnamese Students Against the Vietnam War, because the Washington politicians were all saying, you peaceniks in the US, you know, you may be opposed to that war, but the Vietnamese really want us there. So we had to put the lie to that assertion. Here we are, Vietnamese, and sorry, but that is not true. We are adamantly opposed to the war. And then from there we grew on to become Asian Students Against the Vietnam War, and it was largely located at first in the East Coast, so Yale, Harvard, and Cornell produced a core of our membership. But later on, you know, we reached out to other Southeast Asian students, and we were few and far between back in those days, but we got together a group, and you know, we went to and testified in the Senate and put you know, like an ad 1 square inch big in the New York Times. We thought we could just put an ad in the New York Times until we found out how much it cost. You know, we coughed up enough to take a little space. It was like, you know, 1/4 inch, I think, in the New York Times. But, you know, we learned on our feet. And then in 1971, my husband at the time, Professor Trung Bu Lam, who is a retired professor from the History Department here, and I and our baby moved to Hawaii. And the Vietnam War was still going on, and of course we simply continued struggling against that in connection with the anti-war movement in Hawaii. So I think within the first month of my arrival here, I was introduced to Kokua Hawaii, which was a wonderful organization of young local people, Hawaiian, Japanese, American, you know, the mix, but with a good, strong, solid Kanaka Maoli core to it. And therefore, 2 of the first Kanaka Maoli I met in my life was Solini Hale and Kaleo Patterson, okay?
Wow.
Kalani, excuse me, Kalani Patterson,
right, okay.
Right, sorry. And we just became very close, and they were really organizing very successfully huge demonstrations in front of Schofield and other military installations against the war in which I participated. And I have felt so grateful to them ever since, because here are people with major issues of their own, and they were so moved by what happened to the Vietnamese people that they gave their all to oppose that war. You know, and then in the process, of course, we became friends. My gratitude, my admiration for them just has not wavered since. And then they became involved in other struggles against power, and you know, for the subjugated, Kalama Valley, Waiahole, Waikane. Those were movements at the time to evict local communities from their long lived-in homes, because at that time, land was to Hawaii what gold is to Saudi Arabia, right?
Right.
In other words, everybody off the land, please, only tourists, military need apply, right? So that was the big land eviction struggles. So, so I just continued, you know?
Wow. Wow, that's amazing. And so when you were, because you've been a long supporter and activist in the Hawaiian movement, and so that was a natural segue into finding out the issues?
Absolutely, because, you know, as I said, prominent members of Kokua Hawaii, which were really for justice, and again, specifically justice in the world and anti-eviction in Hawaii, had many Kanaka Maoli components. So then I was teaching anthropology soon after coming to Hawaii, and so I began to learn about the history of Kanaka Maoli, how they were dispossessed. But eventually I began to realize that a lot of the dispossession was carried through what I call legal imperialism, right? It was really the settler state that the missionaries launched, which began to throw Anglo-American law at the Kanaka Maoli population to subjugate them into giving up their resources, or, you know, to just basically steal it, but steal it legally, right? And so that's when I decided to also go into law, not because I love the law by any means, but because I needed to know the nature of this imperialistic tool, okay? And so I combined my anthropological respect for what each different group in the world has historically constructed as a culture that is meaningful to them and that allows them to relate in a meaningful way to each other and to their environment. I combine that respect, I believe, from one field that I studied with the ability to use one imperialist tool against the imperialists themselves, you know, if the chance permits. Right. So the segue into the Hawaiian movement was started with, you know, a very political stance. And then later on, Haunani Ketras came back to teach at the University of Hawaii. At first, I think she worked with the American Friends Service Committee, and she used to live in Waimanalo here near me. So we would drive together very often. We had long, wonderful conversations. And what Haunani added to that political resistance project was also the sense of the importance of language and culture. So, which had been somewhat missing in the sense that it was more a generic progressive language that was being used, and she brought it, you know, into the particulars of the Hawaiian situation, and that added a tremendous dimension to the movement. In a sense, the Marxist analysis is very political and economic, but it lacks a cultural dimension. Not that the war resistance or the anti-eviction resistance was per se Marxist, but it certainly was informed by Marxist analysis of inequalities in the world, which I, you know, to this day am eminently grateful for that insight that the early Marxists, you know, set out for us. But the fault with Marxism, it does not pay sufficient attention to local knowledge and local empowerment through local knowledge. And Haunani, I think, placed that right smack in the middle of our agenda, right? And so it enriched the movement tremendously and gave it a very strong Kanaka Maoli power, okay? Wow. And so then, and then, you know, the interesting thing is that, of course, the power of using culture is that it's much more accessible to people for whom that culture it is, right? Right. But what I worry about is that the opponent also knows that culture is a very resonant dimension of people's existence. So they can try to co-opt culture by trivializing it, so that, you know, the legislature did not used to begin with chants and hulas when I first came to Hawaii, but now it does, right? And that, you know, is supposed to be enough. You know, you lose your land, you lose everything, but you keep, you know, you'll still be able to start the legislative session with these two cultural artifacts. But such cultural artifacts taken out of context is really more a devaluation of culture than it is a respect and honoring of culture, in my view. Yeah, right?
I always think of it as it's a commodification of culture,
absolutely. Right? Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the opponents of the values that we cherish, particularly in indigenous people's struggles, are very aware that this is a possibility for them to exploit the great attachment to culture that exists among indigenous communities for very good reason. Yeah. So we just have to become very savvy about when it is genuine culture and when it is Hollywoodized culture to quell the masses, so to speak. Give them a little lollipop and see if they'll go to sleep.
Like, you're important, you get to open the legislature.
Something like that. But the real importance, you know, is restoring the real power. That's another story altogether. So Soli Nihau has been saying this in the last 2 years, and I really admire him for reminding us. He said, you know, when we started this, we were very political, but we were missing the cultural dimension. Then the cultural moment came, and then unfortunately, the cultural dimension then obliterated the political dimension. So now you have to put them back together, and I think that is absolutely correct.
Okay. I know you moved back to New York at one time, and then you did a lot of work at the UN. Can you talk a little bit about that?
As you may recall, since you were so helpful to me in that particular struggle, I applied for a job at the University of Hawaii Law School, and they actually canceled the search rather than face me as a very likely finalist for the job. And so I sued them, and they had to settle with me. But in the meantime, waiting for the settlement to take place, I then moved on and went to the U.S. continent at the invitation of professors of the University of Wisconsin Law School who had already read my first legal article, which is the Kuleana Act Revisited, which talks about the dispossession through illegal imperialism of Native Hawaiians' rights to their land. And they liked my work, so they thought, you know, it would be wonderful if I had the opportunity to spend more time researching in that direction and obtain an LLM degree. In the process, I had already obtained my JD degree from the law school here in Hawaii. So I went there, and it turns out that the law schools denying me a job was actually a tremendous blessing in disguise. I have to thank them mightily for that. Because it totally opened up the whole international field of struggle for me, right? And I was already realizing that we had to go there, because after Haunani entered my life and lent that added dimension, another Kanaka Maoli personality whom I so hugely admire, I can't even think of anybody else that I might admire on the same par, and that is Dr. Kekuni Blaisdell, of course. He began to talk to me about how can we ever expect to have any remedy from the oppressor's system itself. We have to go above the oppressor, we have to go to the international level. And you know, he absolutely had it right. And so I made it my job while at the University of Wisconsin School of Law to focus on what international avenues, especially in law, are available to Kanaka Maoli and other indigenous peoples in the world who have lost their self-determination, which they had in their ancestral communities, meaning they decided themselves and nobody else did what their political structure would be, what their relations with others would be, what kind of subsistence system they wish to have in their physical environment, what language, what art, what music, what dance. You know, this is how human communities are meant to live fully and meaningfully, and all that was taken away from virtually every indigenous group as we speak. So I have Kekuni and the law school for turning me an international lawyer, one by rejection and one by encouragement.
Right. So then you studied at Wisconsin.
Right.
For it's sort of like a master's or PhD in law, right?
Well, they are really. It's very odd. The first degree in law is called a JD, and that was because lawyers were jealous of social scientists who were called doctors. So they wanted to put JD, which really stands for, you know, a doctor in jurisprudence, right? But basically, it's your first degree. It's like it's a little bit like your BA in law, all right? And then people could teach with a so-called JD/BA in law, but as the competition for teaching jobs in law school increased, then people felt that if they had the next level of accreditation, an LLM, which the M in there stands for masters, right? That would help them with the job market. So that's what I obtained. And then very few, but a number also have the real doctor of law degree. So I am of the middle category.
Right. Okay. But then you went and you started to teach at CUNY, right?
Yes, I went. While I was finishing up my advanced law degree at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I was invited to apply for a job by the dean of the CUNY Law School, Haywood Burns, who is, you know, a shining example of progressive politics. He was a black civil rights leader, a major figure in the Center for Constitutional Rights, a very progressive man who had recruited Patricia Williams, who is a well-known African-American professor of law at Columbia University. Before that, she had been in Wisconsin, where she met me and we became friends. So she encouraged me to apply for the job at the CUNY Law School, and I did, and I got accepted, and I taught there for about, you know, under 10 years, but close to, after which I then moved to the CUNY Graduate Center, which allowed me to just focus on those law fields that I liked and not have to teach the basic property, constitutional law classes.
So how did it link to working at the UN or going to, for the indigenous forums?
Right. As I said, when I left Hawaii, it was already clear to me that redress for the Kanaka Maoli situation here would not be coming from American courts, certainly not alone, not without pressure from international law, international norms, and international institutions. And it so happened that there was a worldwide movement that gelled around the late 60s and the early 70s, where anthropologists, progressive church groups like the World Council of Churches, and then, of course, activist indigenous peoples themselves somehow found each other and realized that there was the classic colonization which happened in the early centuries, for which the UN finally offered a legal remedy, the 1960 Declaration on the Granting of Independence to colonial countries and peoples, but that for some reason the international society had overlooked the fact that there was another form of colonialism, not just the extractive kind of colonialism where the French went to Vietnam to get the rubber out of there, or the English went to India to get the spices out of there. There were settler colonies such as the Americas, such as Australia, such as New Zealand, where just instead of just going in for a spell to get the things they wanted, they actually transposed their entire society onto these other territories. And that at first was not seen as classic colonialism. If anything, that is a much more severe form of colonialism, because actually you now are not only using your resources, they extracted all right, but they also stayed and then imposed their entire paradigm on the indigenous people at a very unequal rate at that, meaning, here we come, but you tribes, are going to be, for example, in the case of the U.S., limited to a tiny percentage of the land that was once yours. So that realization that the decolonization of indigenous peoples in settler colonies had been overlooked in the colonization impulse led these groups to meet together conference after conference and share ideas of what to do. And one of the things they decided they would do is to go to the UN and ask for the UN to appoint a special rapporteur on the situation of indigenous peoples, a very, an exhaustive document that would let the world know who are indigenous peoples, what happened to them, what is happening now, what do they need. And that rapporteur was a gentleman named Kobo, Mr. Kobo. He was from Ecuador, and he was actually helped largely in his report by an anthropologist from Guatemala, whose name was Mr. Diaz. I'm just shortening the names not to confuse people too much. And Mr. Diaz did a fabulous job of delineating the worldwide situation of indigenous peoples, which was, absolutely appalling. So based on that, the General Assembly decided to appoint a working group to draft a declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples. That's how the UN typically handles situations where individuals or collectivities' rights are, intolerably being vandalized by the powers that be. And so that was launched in 1984. And in 1989, I began to participate in their annual meetings. And I stayed with that until the year 2006. So from 1984 until the year 2006, it took us, essentially 20 years to get that declaration finalized and reported out of the human rights community at the UN in Geneva, and sent to the political community of the UN in New York when it was adopted the year later.
Wow. That was a long time. So you were going to Geneva and then...
Virtually every year, right. And I went at first as an academic on my own purse strings, and later on the American Indian Law Alliance asked me to join it as an academic advisor to the process. And so I worked very closely with the American Indian Law Alliance as a volunteer for the remaining years at the UN. And, but fortunately they paid my plane ticket and my hotel bills.
That's great.
Right.
Is there anything else that you would like to share before we end the interview that you feel you need to cover?
Not really, other than that I feel those of us academics who are supporting the independence movement have an obligation we have not fulfilled, which is to translate, you know, our knowledge and analysis into readily accessible form to, you know, non-academics.